Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabis Man podcast. Thank you so much for clicking on the show. I'm your host, Don Kleppen. And if it's your first time here, welcome. Thanks for coming. This is a show where we try to take a journalistic look at all things cannabis as the landscape about cannabis is changing around the United States and the world at large. Countries and states are legalizing cannabis for adult use, those 21 and up, for recreation, as well as medicinal usage. That's being legalized in different parts of the world, and this sort of patchwork legalization and the growing support for legal cannabis is providing this sort of tug of war, this changing landscape around the world, and it's a fascinating time, and I just love talking about this, and I interview people, I endeavor to speak with people who are on the front lines of these changing frontiers, the people who are business owners, entrepreneurs who have created a product or service in the cannabis industry that's allowing you and I, consumers, to try some new products that are in the cannabis space or new services that we haven't tried before. That's very exciting in the legal cannabis markets. There's also research that's being done by university professors, by scientists, doctors, are looking into finally what cannabis, how it affects the body, what is capable, what the plant is capable of doing to our bodies and how it can help in different ways, and also what we need to be wary of. That kind of stuff, this information about cannabis is crucially important as we move forward in this legal space where it's going to become a more normalized part of our lives and society, which is a day that I hope for all the time. The stigma against cannabis is very much alive and well. I personally am of the opinion that substances like alcohol, sugar, caffeine are way too normalized in our society. We hardly, I think most of us, hardly give it a second thought to imbibe any of those, but things like cannabis are still so stigmatized. People keep them at arm's length. There's all this still believed propaganda, this nonsense from the Reefer Madness years that people still buy into, and you see this resistance even in states that could really benefit from a medical cannabis program. You see this resistance from the people in charge because they believe just hooky, completely cockamamie things about cannabis, and cockamamie's not a word I use very often. I'm not sure where that came from, but anyway, that's the kind of stuff that you can expect to hear on this show, and I really appreciate everybody who has been along with me for this ride from the beginning, everyone who's listened and left reviews and engaged with the show on social media, sent emails. I can't thank you enough. This has been such a great experience, and I'm still so excited to have these conversations all the time, and I have another great conversation to bring you today. I'm speaking with a doctor who's been involved in medical cannabis for many years. She's done a lot of fascinating studies, and something that she's talking about that was reflected in her most recent work, a recent study, was that she believes all of us, everybody who imbibes cannabis, we are all taking way too low amounts of CBD. That's right. She has some fascinating information to share as to why she believes that the dosage that we're all sort of settled on for CBD is really too low for human beings. And she believes that if we were to set that much higher, that people would indeed feel more benefits from CBD only as opposed to the combinations with THC that you see a lot of products endeavor to make. A lot of gummies do the balance of THC, CBD. I have mentioned several on the show. I've interviewed people who are sort of trying to find this happy medium of a low THC amount and higher CBD, but it's a great conversation, and I look forward to you hearing it. If you'd like to engage with the show on social media, it's at C-Man Podcast, the letter C, Man, on Twitter and Instagram. It's the Cannabis Man Podcast on Facebook, or it's at Don Kleppen, D. Kleppen, Kleppin, wherever you find me on social media. I usually share stuff from the show on my pages as well, and TikTok, because TikTok is Chinese owned and very not cannabis friendly. They do not allow very much mention of cannabis on it at all. If you're on there, if you're on TikTok, you can find some clips from the podcast under my page, which is at Radio Fit. I also wanted to let you know that there's a new way to to support this podcast, if you're interested, you can support the show by becoming a subscriber to the Cannabis Man podcast, and I've changed it so that subscribers can offer some direct support to the show. You don't have to go through Patreon anymore. You don't have to go through any separate website or service. You should be able to just click a subscribe button that is available wherever you're listening to this podcast. Spotify, Apple, iHeart, wherever you listen to this. A subscribe button should be there, and if you click that, you'll get a message thanking you for your support, and it'll give you some different options of what to give, if anything, that you feel is warranted, and any support at all is very, very much appreciated. And I personally, this is a lot of work, and as I've mentioned before, it's something that I do on my own. It is a labor of love. I love these conversations, and it is something that I'm able to do on my own, but, we've all got bills to pay, and I'm trying to keep this show relatively ad-free so that it can be pretty streamlined and just get you the information. But in addition to that, I wanted to tell you that there is going to be some exciting new options coming down the road for subscribers. The first thing that I'm bringing to subscribers is anybody who supports the show is going to get a shout out from me in future episodes. If you give to the show, I'm going to give you credit as somebody who is contributing to the show, and I'm going to give you that shout out because you are then a part of this show just like I am. So that's very much appreciated, and there's going to be more coming down the line. There'll be exclusive content. I've got some ideas for merch. There'll be early options for subscribers to get access to that stuff, and there'll be more and more coming down the line, like early access to episodes and things of that nature. So if any of that interests you, if you're looking for ways to just simply say, hey, thanks, Don, for the work you're doing. You're doing good stuff. Any support, very much appreciated on my end. And again, the best way to support is exactly what you're doing. Just simply listen to the show, share it with your friends, leave a rating or review, and subscribe, and just keep coming back every week as we have these conversations, because it is a very exciting and fun time in the cannabis space. This green frontier is expanding all the time, every day, and there's always some news or new products or some events coming up that I can share with you, and I love doing that. So without further ado, let's get into this episode of the Cannabis Man podcast. Here we go.
This is Tommy Chong, and you're listening to the Cannabis broadcast.
Yeah, there we are. Now let's get into the news joint wrap. This is the part of the show where I bring to you some news stories relating to cannabis in the state of Illinois, or some events that have happened or are coming up down the line that you might be interested in, and it's all curated by IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Think of it as the joint you can hit for all your Illinois cannabis news and reviews. And let's start with an article posted by Jason Brown, who edits the Illinois News Joint here. He says, Medical Cannabis Advisory Board hosts its inaugural meeting. Now, this happened August 7th. The MCAB convened its first official meeting on the 7th. During that meeting, board members and State Department officials introduced and discussed the role of the board, as well as the scope, bylaws, and expectations, and then took questions from the public. And as Jason says, it included a multitude of members from diverse cannabis-related backgrounds. We're talking about nurses, doctors, medical patients, teachers, and more. The deputy for the administration at the Cannabis Regulation Oversight Office, or CROO, C-R-O-O, if you like, which I do. That man's name is Solomon Hatch. He gave summary of CROO's functions, including studies that they undertake, statutory requirements, and work with many other departments involved with the legalization of cannabis here in Illinois. Now, the public was allowed to comment before it was adjourned. 2 medical patients spoke, gave suggestions for improving the program with personal anecdotes. The first commenter spoke about the difficulties in acquiring expiring medicine because there simply are not enough medical cannabis dispensaries within close proximity, and that the only new dispensaries opening are adult use retail stores that cater to recreational users and not medical patients. The med patient also mentioned the high costs of medicine. All fair points, and I know that I personally live in the Chicago area, but obviously Illinois is a very big state. There's a lot of Illinois that is not in that northeast corner, and so we need to get more dispensaries up and running, which is, again, going to keep bringing prices down as competition forces businesses to lower those. I talked about that last week. We were already seeing it, which is a great thing, but even so, that report that I talked about in the last episode highlighted that Illinois prices still are the highest, among the highest in the country anyway, and medical patients are still feeling that as well. You do at least save on the taxes as a med patient, which is great, but, the med card is not without cost, so it's kind of a trade-off there. You can read more about that story at IllinoisNewsJoint.com. On a related note here, Jason mentions that Illinois medical cannabis sales cannot keep up with adult use. Now, that relates to how many adult use retail stores there are versus the medical dispensaries, which just came up in that anecdote during the meeting. So there are fewer places that med patients can buy their medicine from, as well as the fact that there are so many more adult use customers who will be buying, people who are buying it without med cards. There's going to be more of them buying than medical patients. So I think this article talking about how the sales can't really keep up, I feel strongly that that's going to be a phenomenon that persists long into the future. I just think there's always going to be more adult rec users than med patients with cannabis. Even med patients, I think from time to time, their cards will expire. You might just forget your card, and then you end up going and paying the taxes because you don't want to go back to your place or whatever. People have different reasons for letting those med cards expire or whatever. So I just want to point out that I personally believe that the adult use prices, or the sales rather, are always going to be higher and even dwarf, I would imagine, the medical sales in the state. And then there's a great 3-part piece here, this series, 3 articles that Jason did, and he basically breaks down the adult use legalization effect on medical prices. Now, this is sort of, again, all-encompassing look as to what we were just talking about in terms of how many medical sales there are, how many patients, and the cost to med patients versus adult use, and all of those things. So the effect that adult use legalizing has on the prices of medical products, Jason goes through and breaks all of that down over a 3-article series, and I highly recommend you check it out. I won't go through it here, but I will share a link on the show socials, and as always, you can find out more about all of these stories and events coming up near you related to cannabis at IllinoisNewsJoint.com. One more thing before we get to the interview. I saw an article that I thought was worth bringing to your attention here. This is from HighTimes.com. Speaking of High Times, the High Times Illinois Cannabis Cup is underway right now. Those competing have already submitted their products, and the judging kits are going to become available next weekend. I'm recording this episode on August 13th. I'll air it tomorrow, and on the 19th is when these judge kits are going to become available, and the Cannabis Man podcast is getting one of them. So I'm going to be judging some of these products, and I will bring my thoughts about them directly to you. I'm very excited about that. This will be my first time being a Cannabis Cup judge here, and I'm excited to test out some of these products that I haven't tried before. But on that note, this High Times article, the headline reads here, survey, 58% of cultivators feel bad or terrible about current state of cannabis. The subheader is the survey included more than 400 growers across 8 U.S. states. Now, 58% is not dire. We're not talking about 95% of cultivators feel that way. 58%, it's a little over half, but the reason that this sticks out to me is because I would juxtapose this, put it right up against some of the same surveys that happened a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. The state, I believe, of cannabis at that time was much more optimistic, even 6 months ago or so. I personally would think that those same surveys, this same survey, would have found less than 50% of cultivators saying that they feel bad or terrible about the current state of it. Now, I'm not going to read this full thing. I encourage you to check out hightimes.com and see it for yourself. I will, of course, share this article on the show's social pages, but new research findings show exactly how the employees are faring in the current climate. This is the third edition of the U.S. Cannabis Cultivator Survey from Wells Fargo, and it says a majority of growers have a grim outlook on the current state of the cannabis market, and this is all from the Green Market Report. It digs in a little bit deeper to the responses from the 400 growers that took part in this. They say specifically 34% answered that, quote, I feel terrible, things look awful, while 24% said, quote, I feel bad, things don't look good. Additionally, 31% of respondents said they feel okay. Only 9% of cultivators say they feel good, and 2% said they feel great about the current state of the market. Survey also looked at responses by state, finding that California, which also has the highest number of growers, felt most negative about the current market, with 66% of cultivators expressing a bad or terrible outlook on the market at large. Most of the negativity was because of falling wholesale prices, with 34% of respondents citing this as their main source of stress, followed by restrictive regulations at 29% and lack of distribution avenues at 10%. As the largest cannabis market in the world, California saw a dip in cannabis sales last year, the first since adult use sales launched in 2018 there. The loss is likely due to a decreased price per pound of cannabis across the state. Now, this may ring familiar to you, listener, if you've been listening to this podcast at all. I have been ringing this bell now for, at least to me, what feels like the majority of this show. The prices that the cannabis producers can charge these cultivators, they vary state by state. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode, as I talked about last week, Illinois has some of the highest prices in the nation, as they say. Now, I understand, and the medical patients that were mentioned in the Illinois News Joint article, the pain that's being felt by people who use cannabis as their medicine, the prices for you, I get that it's not only not fun, but it feels untenable. It feels not sustainable for you to be able to not afford your medicine like this. I want to be clear that I have felt and I continue to feel that pain as well. I'm with you there. But my argument has always been that it would never stay this high, because simply by introducing competition into the market, businesses would end up going against each other and prices have to fall. Now, there is a sweet spot. That's ultimately what my point last week was, and I'm not going to rehash myself here. Please go back and check out last week's episode if you haven't heard it by now. But my point was that there's a sweet spot economically for these businesses where there's a sweet spot economically for these businesses and for us as consumers, right? Where the value of what we're buying is high and the prices are not too high. I know that we would all love to buy high quality cannabis for next to nothing. It would be lovely if, high quality weed was just flowing like wine through the streets of every state of the country and everybody could just scoop it, bend down with two hands and scoop up handfuls and run back home, and this was something you could do every day, or it just grew on trees and you could walk down the block and pluck a bunch of fresh buds and just, go do whatever you wanted to. That would be lovely, but that's not the real world. These businesses have incentive, and that incentive is profits. They want high profit margins. Now, it should not be that they are raking it in on the backs of us. And I understand that for 3 years in Illinois, there were a lot of whales, a lot of big fish who did exactly that, who raked it in on the backs of us and those visiting from out of state who bought adult use. That is not the way of the future, though. And the thing that we need to be so careful of And this gets back to the High Times article and the state of affairs in California and Colorado and pretty much along the West Coast in terms of cannabis markets, which is that their prices have fallen past that point for them where they no longer have an incentive to make high quality stuff because they're not able to make a high enough profit based on the wholesale prices. And so quality then suffers. I've heard it from people who have shopped in Colorado and Michigan and California. I know there's good stuff available there, and if you found some, good for you. By all means, continue to mine that vein. Continue to pump that well. That's good. But there's a lot of people who are noticing subpar quality in these state markets from products that they get from dispensary store shelves, and that is a direct result of the lower profit margins for these businesses. When they have no incentive to profit, they lose their incentive to making quality products, and then they just put garbage on the store shelves. And one of my points last week was that it doesn't matter how good of a deal you got. If the product you end up with at home is garbage, then you paid too much. And that is ultimately what people in Michigan and Colorado and California are starting to feel like. And that is not a place that's good for anybody, because a few years of that, and it's going to be like Canada, where basically they're considering doing away with the legal cannabis market because it's been such a failure. Not in every province there, but in many of them. And that is what I fear, is that this experiment with legal cannabis, if it fails in terms of profit potential, if it doesn't make enough money for the government to change its ways, for these businesses to offer you and I better products, better services, it's just going to go away. It's going to go back to the way things were, and that's not something that any of us wants. And I would argue that is a much worse fate than paying a little higher prices for that cannabis while it's around right now. So I'll share the High Times article. You can read it for yourself. And please, if I'm wrong about this, if you have any thoughts about it, please reach out to me. If you think that I'm way off about this price point thing, if you think that I'm spouting garbage about, what the economics of this are, please let me know. Hit me up at C-Man Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. Email the show, host@cannabismanpodcast.com. Let me know. Listener, welcome back. My guest today is a medical cannabis expert. She's the medical director of Canna Centers Wellness and Education. It's a California-based medical practice which is devoted to educating patients about the use of cannabis for serious and chronic medical conditions. After years of working in the specialty of pediatric emergency medicine, she developed an interest in the science of medical cannabis after witnessing its beneficial effects in an ill friend. And over the last 13 years, she's evaluated thousands of patients for use of medical cannabis and has been recognized as an expert in the clinical application of cannabis therapeutics. And she's here today to talk about the work that she's done. Listener, please welcome Dr. Bonnie Goldstein. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you.
It's my pleasure. And did I have that right? Have you been working in medical cannabis for about the last 13 years or so?
It's actually 15 years this year.
Wow. Well, hey, congratulations. It's a nice milestone right there, 15. And your latest book, by the way, I didn't mention this, but that's Cannabis is Medicine, How Medical Cannabis and CBD Are Healing Everything from Anxiety to Chronic Pain. And so I just want to kind of jump into the work that you're doing. Medical cannabis, and you're based in California. Let's just talk about you. What was this witnessing moment for you in a friend of yours that you sort of found the benefits personally of medical cannabis?
Well, sure. So I just want to set the stage. At the time, I had been working as a pediatric emergency medicine physician, mostly graveyard shift, meaning up all night, coming home and taking care of a young child during the day, as they call it, burning the candle at both ends. And I was fairly exhausted, and I had taken a little time off, like a leave of absence, just to kind of collect myself and just to get some sleep and to spend more time with my child. And at that time, a friend was sick with cancer and asked me about medical cannabis. And the lay of the land at the time, this is about 2006, 2007 in California. We had a law called the Compassionate Use Act that had passed in 1996, but it was voted in by Californians really without any physician input, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, and to be honest, doctors didn't want to have anything to do with it, because if you saw patients and you had recommended cannabis to them, there was this threat, possibly, that you might lose your license. The state had made it clear pretty early on after the law was passed, and the medical board had made it clear pretty early on that they did not look upon this with open eyes. So
Wow.
most doctors, we had heard about the law, but most doctors were not involved. It was just a very, very small group of doctors who were leading the way. Anyway, I started doing some research for my friend, and I learned about something called the endocannabinoid system, which I had never heard of. I read the articles that are published about how cannabis can help with nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy. And I also read a number of studies that reported that cannabis was safe. And so I talked with her about it. I encouraged her to try it, very carefully,
Mm-hmm.
as one might approach. And she had great results. And rather than being, in her bedroom or on the bathroom floor, sick, she was sitting having dinner with her kids. I mean, what a difference for her. And that was really very eye-opening for me.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that story, and I think anybody can imagine just the way you kind of put it, that difference in quality of life for somebody, what medical cannabis was able to give that person, the ability to experience those things and not be just gripped by symptoms of the illness. That's fantastic. Now, medical cannabis. Now, obviously, there are many states that have finally, given a green light to medical cannabis, and I'm here in Illinois. They did so back in 2014-ish, and there have been many other states that have done it, but there's still the stigma that you kind of referenced there at the beginning when California, even though they had voted in this law, there was this unspoken truth that any doctors who prescribed it would be looked down upon. It would be made known that that was not the right thing to do, and here we are in 2023, and those kinds of stigmas, I think, still exist. And you see different studies still kind of coming out, which are sort of highlighting some risks or negative elements of cannabis. In your work since that time, since, as you mentioned, for the last 15 years now, what have you found in the studies to be, in your mind, no longer questionable in terms of benefits of medical cannabis? What do you think is proof that it can help with now?
Right. It's a great question. And one thing I just want to say is, because cannabis still remains as a Schedule I drug, we are still prohibited from studying the benefits. If I wanted to set up a study to see if THC, let's say, helps neuropathic pain, I have to jump through lots of hoops, probably take at least 3 to 5 years of paperwork to get approved by the federal government, again, because it's a Schedule I drug, in order to do my study. So what I want to share with everybody is the studies that are out there are all studies on people who either are self-medicating or using cannabis without any type of guidance by a medical physician. That is like, you diagnosing yourself with pneumonia and walking into the pharmacy and picking out a drug and treating yourself. And although you might be quite educated and you may read online, there is something to the art of medicine that you might want to have some medical supervision with that, right?
Right.
Yes?
Totally reasonable.
Okay.
Yes.
So think about all the studies that we have that show the detrimental effects of cannabis. The vast majority of them are on young people who have chronic, heavy use of THC without medical guidance. The medical community is trying to say, well, we have no studies. Well, of course, let us do studies. But this is what I can tell you after 15 years. Cannabis is a great alternative to sleeping pills. Cannabis helps so many of my patients sleep. And believe it or not, the only study that really documents sleep as a primary outcome came out of Australia just last year. And it documented very nice results with people using THC for sleep. And what they found was really interesting. They used one of those wrist monitors that measures your sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And all the things that my patients have been telling me over the years, that it helps them fall asleep easier. It helps them sleep all night, so meaning a longer duration of sleep. When they wake up, they feel well rested. They don't get up as much in the middle of the night, right? All of that was documented in this small study on people using THC for sleep from Australia. So what patients reported, which most doctors report, is anecdotal evidence, not proof, This was proven with this, measuring device that these patients or these subjects wore in that study. What else does cannabis help for? No question it helps anxiety. Now, it's dose related. And, there's the famous saying that, dose makes the poison, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you overdo, sometimes it can make you think too much or stay up at night. For anxiety, if you take too much, you can make yourself anxious. So dosing is important. And if you don't know what you're doing and you just walk into a dispensary and buy something and go home and try it, you may not have gotten the proper dosing instructions to get a good result. So no wonder that sometimes people say it makes me more anxious or it didn't work, right? Again, if you're using it as medicine, it might be helpful to get some medical input. What else does it help with? No question it helps with pain. In multiple studies out of Israel, out of other countries, we see that people report when they start a medical cannabis program that they are able to reduce the use of other pain medications. And as you well know, we have an opioid crisis going on in this country, and cannabis should be an option for those people using opioids. If you look into the scientific literature, it is reported over and over and over again that opioids are not a good solution for chronic pain. They just don't work that well long term. What else is it good for? So in my practice, I see a lot of children with epilepsy. Somewhere around 75 to 80% of the patients that come to me with intractable epilepsy, which means drug resistant, no medicine has ever stopped their seizures, which is about 1/3 of all people who experience seizures, I see in about 75 to 80% some reduction of seizures.
Wow.
And about 10 to 15% we see seizure freedom. Now, again, these are people, mostly children in my practice, who are being told there is no medicine that will ever make your child seizure free. Doesn't it behoove us as physicians to offer these children an opportunity to be seizure free, even if it's only 10% of them?
I'm so everything that you just said, Dr. Goldstein, I appreciate, because it really there's a lot there, and I've definitely offered my own anecdotal support of everything you mentioned, the sleep, the chronic pain issues. That's definitely, as you say, it's been supported by the studies that are out there. It's been supported by a whirlwind of anecdotal evidence. I just think that, and especially as you note, it's even more kind of ridiculous up against this opioid crisis that has been gripping America for the last several years. And there are, states that I think suffer a little more from that crisis, states that tend to have higher prescription rates for chronic pain to opioids. And those states have not yet greenlit medical cannabis. Some of them, not all, but I'm thinking kind of like West Virginia, Kentucky, there are high opioid use rates and death rates from that use. And it is really unfortunate that we're still dealing with this stigma, dealing with this pushback, when, as you point out, cannabis is this great alternative for people, whether it's sleep issues, whether it's nausea, chronic pain. And as you were talking about the epilepsy, these seizures, that is something that I remember seeing headlines about this in the mid-2010s, like sort of 2013, 2014. There were some stories of families that were moving. They were uprooting their family from places like New Jersey or the East Coast to Colorado, or places where medical cannabis was just allowed. And the life-changing medicine that cannabis was for those kids, it's just incredible. And obviously you've seen that for yourself firsthand. And what in your estimation, what is it going to take, I guess, to remove this from the Schedule I substance list? I realize you can't, predict the future or anything, but does it feel like we're closer to you now, to that point?
I do think we're closer. And there was some, talk about it from the Biden administration about looking at removing it from the Schedule I. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a high priority because of so many other things going on in the world. I think the biggest problem is that we have politicians who know nothing about cannabis. They don't know anything about the endocannabinoid system. They wouldn't even know if I said the name of a seizure drug. They don't even know about that. But they have it, all the propaganda from a young age that's really been kind of put upon all of us, floating around in their brain saying cannabis is bad. It's a drug of abuse. Now, yeah, all drugs can be abused. I mean, this is nothing new.
Right.
It doesn't seem that there are very many politicians involved with chemotherapy or the seizure drugs that my patients get prescribed, or children with autism getting prescribed atypical antipsychotics as the only 2 FDA approved drugs. And I've seen those cause some really serious, irreversible side effects like diabetes. Like I had a child who was 70 pounds at 11 years old and was started on one of these drugs. And within 4 months, he weighed 140 pounds.
Oh my
Just
gosh.
what you want, a larger child who still has a severe amount of aggression.
Right.
I mean, to me, it's criminal that we are still having this conversation today in 2023 about Schedule 1 status. If you're worried about it, then take it off the schedule. Don't reschedule it, deschedule it, and let us study it under medical supervision. What are we afraid of? That we're going to find it works? And guess what? It's not magic. It doesn't work for everybody. But for the people for whom it does work, why are we standing in the way? If it was your loved one, wouldn't you want them to have this option?
Completely. I appreciate you putting it that way, because I feel strongly the same, and I've mentioned it on the show many times, exactly that. Like, just the notion of studying it, just answering these questions, is the fact that there's so much pushback even to that is ridiculous, and it just kind of shows that the rationality is not really at the heart of what the pushback against this is. This is the living remnants of the propaganda you mentioned, the reefer madness, this stigma from the 1900s, all that, the DARE education and all these kinds of, videos of the FDA from, that we all got to see in public school. Like, those ripple effects are still controlling people's instincts about what cannabis is and what it is not. And I really appreciate what you're saying now.
Well, and one of the things that I'm finding kind of fascinating is that my colleagues in the medical field still cannot separate medical and recreational use. They cannot seem to separate it. We separate it when we talk about, let's say, someone shooting up heroin versus somebody using an opioid responsibly.
Right.
We understand that. Pretty simple, right?
Oh, yeah.
Not a really deep concept, I think, overall. So when I have, like, let's say, for instance, a psychiatrist that reaches out to me and says that the child who I'm treating for a deadly cancer is having some anxiety, and they think that the THC that they're on is causing that, I just think, so you're going to ignore the fact that here's a child who's had 5 brain surgeries and tons of intervention and hospitalizations and is completely and totally traumatized by her experience. You're not going to consider that as part of her anxiety, but yet you're going to blame the THC, which she's been on for years, that has actually helped her. And the parents see that when they take it away, her life falls apart. And then what you share with me is that you see teenagers who abuse THC and they have anxiety. So now you're equating a child under medical supervision using a full cannabinoid regimen, CBD, THC, and CBG for her deadly cancer. And you're going to compare that with a teenager who's frankly just out smoking pot with his buddies. Okay.
Right.
How do I educate my colleagues when they lump everybody into the same boat? That is really amazing brainwashing, isn't it?
It is. And thank you for saying it that way too, because I think that's a crucial point that really doesn't get brought up enough, which is that distinguishing between medical and recreational use. It is kind of ridiculous to not see that there's two sides to how somebody might make use of the different products and such. And on the note of CBD, I am, there's something that I love CBD. I've had, gummies. I've had a lot of products that are CBD only. But what I worry about is that CBD unquestionably, in my mind, has, all these benefits, a lot of ones that you just kind of highlighted before, talking about what symptoms specifically it can help address. And not that THC doesn't play a role at that, it does. But for CBD products specifically, I'm kind of wondering, I've been seeing a lot in the last couple of years of, promises of what it can deliver. And one thing that I do worry about is that we're kind of entering this place where it feels to me like all the magic, all the great stuff that CBD can legitimately offer is being sort of overshadowed by the false promises maybe of, how many things it can address. It can, save your life according to some advertisements. And I guess guess what I, and I don't know if you'll have an answer for this, and I don't mean to put you on the spot at all, but I'm just kind of curious. Do you worry about that? The sort of that people's attitudes, skeptical as they already are toward cannabis, with this, some snake oil salesman talking about CBD, I worry that it can kind of ruin the batch. Do you get what I'm saying at all about that?
I do. Overpromise and underdeliver.
Right.
Yeah. And look, the way I look at it is that each individual has their own endocannabinoid system, has also their own chemistry otherwise, okay, meaning you have your genetics that determines the way that you're going to respond to things. You also have your lifestyle, and there are way too many factors involved with each individual for anybody to guess how you're going to respond to cannabis. We know that CBD hits over 65 different places in the brain and body, including various receptors, including enzymes, including what's called transporter molecules or transporter proteins. If you think that you're going to guess how somebody's going to respond, oh, my friend has anxiety and I gave her some CBD and I know it's going to help her, that is very naive. But it's the same with any medication, right? How do you know how you're going to respond to any medication? Our ERs are filled up with people who take medicine and are having bad reactions to it, right? So luckily, CBD doesn't do that. So it's certainly worth a try if you're not feeling well, but you should educate yourself. You know how many people come into my office and say, I tried CBD and it didn't work. And the first thing I say is, what's the product? How much did you take? And how did you take it? Because that matters. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know what you're doing and you think you're just going to walk, it's not like walking into a pharmacy and let's say you just have a headache and you buy some aspirin or some other over-the-counter pain reliever and you take it. Those products usually have one target in the brain or body where it kind of is a direct line. Cannabinoid compounds work differently. And there's no way to guess how you're going to respond and whether or not you're going to be a responder. The vast majority of people who take CBD are underdosing. And many of the people who say it's not working are likely underdosing. Let's say you buy a bottle of CBD for $100, okay? And let's say it has, 200 milligrams in it. And your dose, your real dose, unbeknownst to you, but let's just say if you were working with a doctor, you figured out your dose is 100 milligrams. You just bought a bottle with 2 doses in it for $100.
Good God.
Right? That is not the proper product.
Right.
And the analogy is a grown person, let's say an adult who weighs 150 pounds, walking in and buying infant fever reducer, acetaminophen, let's say.
Right.
Which is like infant Tylenol. Well, it's the right drug, but you certainly wouldn't buy the infant version of it.
Makes perfect sense, yeah.
Right. So dosing matters. The concentration of the product matters. If you buy 10 milligram CBD pills and you need, like I said, 100 or 150 milligrams, do you really want to take 15 pills of 10 milligrams? No, you would probably want to buy a different product. But nobody thinks about dosing. They just think about, I'm going to try some CBD. Right. And the same thing with THC. People walk into a, licensed in California, licensed legal dispensary, and they pick something up. And unfortunately, in these dispensaries, occasionally you come across somebody well-educated, but certainly it's not a medical or healthcare trained professional who's advising you. It's a salesperson. And do you know what you're doing? Do you know that those cannabinoids don't interfere with the drugs that your doctor has prescribed to you? Especially for patients with cancer, especially senior citizens. Don't you think it behooves you to talk to somebody first about and have a plan? I mean, cannabis always works better medically when you have a plan, always. And it's really unfortunate that the system that we have now does not support physicians learning about cannabis, educating their patients about it, and then assisting them to find the cannabis regimen that works for them. And, we didn't even touch upon, there's not only THC and CBD, there's CBG, cannabigerol. I treat patients with cannabidiolic acid. I treat patients with cannabidivarin. I treat patients with what's called THCA, tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, which is the raw form of THC. Wow. We have all these different compounds, and they all have very somewhat unique but overlapping medicinal properties. And it got a little complicated. So to kind of simplify it, I bought some CBD and I took it and it didn't work, to me is like, just absolutely barely scratching the surface.
Yeah, totally understand that. And that's another great point, just this oversimplification of even, and I've talked about this on the show before too, even the notion of, there are hundreds of different compounds in cannabis plants, and we talk about the entourage effect, and I think you were possibly alluding to that a little bit before when you're isolating these different compounds and trying to get a certain effect out of it, or, address a certain receptor in the body or brain, whatever. I understand, that it's difficult to get desired results when you isolate different substances from a cannabis compound. And even splitting it up into just CBD and THC, or rather splitting it up into things like sativa versus indica, is such an oversimplification of what the different categories really are and how many different compounds are in it. As you say, we are really just scratching the surface. And as you mentioned, it seems like the number one thing to do is to really just cut the red tape and allow doctors and scientists to really dive in and answer some of these questions and really figure out, the answers that we're looking for here. And I just want to say again, Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, thank you so much for jumping on. I like to wrap these things up by doing some quick hits questions about, your favorite foods and movie and music and stuff. Are you game for this?
Sure. Why not? I don't know.
Great.
I'm not very good on the spot, but go ahead.
Oh, no worries. I'm sure it'll be great. But first one I usually start with is morning bird or night owl? Which are you?
Oh, night owl.
Nice. Night owl. Up late rather than getting up with the sun. That's easier.
Oh,
to
no,
keep it
I
going.
get up, but I prefer being a night owl.
Got it. Yes, I understand that too. It's easier to stay up than to get up earlier, I feel like, no matter
That's
what.
why I worked graveyard shift for many years.
Yeah, that's right. You got to be able to be a night owl to stick it out through that. Favorite foods or cuisine? If you're celebrating something, is there a restaurant or a specific meal or type of food that, either makes you feel like the comfort of home or just kind of puts you in a good place? What do you like to eat?
Well, in general, I'm very particular about what I eat, trying to eat healthy, just whole foods, as they say, not advertising the store, but
Right.
Lots of plants. Plants are good for you. I try to incorporate mushrooms, which are anti-cancer. Try to incorporate also, though, on my birthday, a nice slice of chocolate cake.
Nice. There it is. The chocolate cake. I love it. That's, you got to have some birthday cake, man. Let's enjoy the fun days. And then substance of choice. I ask this of all my guests. We're mentioning cannabis, but are you a coffee drinker in the morning? Do you like tea throughout the day, beer or wine in the evening? What substances do you typically lean on?
No, I don't really lean on any substances, so.
Nothing? That's totally cool. It's a good answer. I'm always curious as to, what different people kind of lean on. And I think it's cool if you're in a place where you don't really need anything. That's excellent.
I find incorporating exercise and getting out and walking and being around Mother Nature. I'm very lucky to live in Southern California, where I can leave my house and be in 10 minutes on a beautiful hiking trail. That is key to my mental health.
That is awesome. Really very cool. And that Southern California weather does beckon you outside. We're still waiting for spring to actually to spring here in Chicago, but I definitely appreciate the weather out there. Favorite movie or TV? What do you like to watch either at the end of a day if you're trying to unwind, or something that you might have watched it when you were younger that always puts you in a good mood? If you see it on TV, you'll always leave it on. What's something you like to watch?
That's a hard one for me. The occasional chick flick, I suppose, if it pops up.
Sure. Yeah, those are fun. Just, sort of a easy comedy.
Get out of my romantic comedy, just to get out of my own head.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think that's great. Put your brain onto that for a while. And then final one, you did mention hiking, but I'm always curious about, other hobbies you might have outside of work and what you're doing. Anything like, build any birdhouses or, any kind of activity that you, that takes up your time aside from hiking?
I like reading. I like spending time with my family. I would say that's about it. Yeah, there's not that many hours in the day for me to have that much free time
No.
to delve into hobbies. I'm usually working.
Totally, and that's plenty. I mean, you got beautiful weather, and hiking is healthy, and reading is always good to do, and family time is I think we should all be endeavoring to maximize that as much as we can. So that sounds like a good list of hobbies to me, and it sounds like the work that you're doing is very important, and I definitely appreciate it, and I believe that in the future we're all going to benefit more from it. Thank you, Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, Medical Director of Canna Centers Wellness and Education in California. Thanks for stopping by and talking cannabis today.
Happy to do so.
All right, take care.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
And there you have it, listener. I'd like to thank my guest once again, Dr. Bonnie Goldstein. She is so great. She had so much fascinating information there. I could have talked to her forever, and I definitely want to bring her back on the show again. But how about that? Have you ever considered that maybe we're all taking too low dosage of CBD, and that's why that nobody ever feels it if it's just CBD on its own? Would you take something that's 100 milligrams of CBD and no THC? Would you be willing to do that? I would. And I'm looking forward to trying it out. I hope that there are some more products that come available that are more at that dosage point, that area of milligrams, so that I can try that out. But I am looking forward to it, and I think that Dr. Goldstein's points there are valid, and I encourage you to check that study out as well and see for yourself. One more thing before I let you go this week, listener. This was an historic cannabis reform policy. Has been posed here in a different part of the world, southwest corner of the globe, if you like, at least from where I am here in the U.S. Cannabis policy reform history made in Australia. That's right, Dan Anda. They are looking into legalizing cannabis. They're at least going to have a vote on it. And this was posted today, August 13th, from when I'm recording this Sunday. Australian cannabis reform efforts reached an historic milestone this week with Greens Senator David Shoebridge introducing the Legalizing Cannabis Bill 2023. The measure would permit the, quote, adult recreational use of cannabis across the country, end quote. I just wanted to make note of this, listener, because on August 13th of 2023, Australia has officially espoused a more sensible position on cannabis than the United States of America, as well as the United Kingdom and many other countries out there for that matter. Well done, Australia. I don't know. I mean, I know that there's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on down there. I've heard people say that, the middle of that country is like the Florida of the world. And it just some crazy stuff happens. And I can't imagine what life is like, dodging kangaroos and, high-fiving koalas on your way into the office every day and stuff. It sounds dope. And now it's going to be even doper because they're going to add some legal cannabis to the mix. But countrywide is the part that really struck me. This is not just, restricted to Sydney, and the coastal cities there. They're allowing full country legalization of cannabis. And there's a quote down here from Senator Shoebridge, which I thought was great. They included it in the press release. He says, quote, "It's time to stop pretending that consumption of this plant, consumed each year by literally millions of Australians, should still be seen as a crime. Everyone knows that it is not a matter of if we legalize cannabis in Australia, it is a matter of when. And today we're taking a huge step forward. The Greens are here to get this done, and we'll be working hard to get the numbers to make this law," Senator Shoebridge also stated. That's the end of that quote. And it goes on. There's more to it. Again, I'll share this article so you can check it out as well. Definitely worth your time to peruse, but I just personally wanted to make note of this because I think as we in the U.S. are struggling, and I know that there are plenty of you out there who are just ripping your hair out going, hey, Australia is a different country than the U.S. They also, reform their gun laws after shootings and whatnot. They've done a lot that the U.S. could never do. And there's a lot more people in the U.S. than there is in Australia, a lot of other countries around the world. I get it. We're different countries. So highlighting a political movement or the passage of a law there, policy change there versus here, I understand it's not a perfect or direct translation. However, the way I see it, today, right now, they are the more rational, coherent adults in this world than the people leading the US, the UK, or any of the other supposed progressive leaders of Western society, or whatever it is you want to call it. But Australia is waving the flag of supremacy today, and I wish them all the best. And it seems like, based on their surveys there and the support, the signatures that they got to make this happen, it seems like it's not going to be much of an issue for them to make it law. And I will obviously update you when that does become official. But how does that make you feel? You know, that you could go and visit Australia, of all places, and that soon that's going to be a fully legal country of cannabis. I know we've talked about Ukraine. Germany is also on this path. There are many countries who are doing it. Again, none of them the U.S., and I'm glad states here are doing it. And there is some real movement. You know, I've got sources talking about the discussions on D.C., on Capitol Hill. When these congressmen come back to Capitol Hill after their summer recess, which is over after Labor Day. So when they come back in September, Chuck Schumer says one of the first things they're going to be talking about is safe banking. I've talked about the safe banking bill here. Short of removing cannabis from the Schedule I substance list, short of descheduling that and all the help and freedom that would provide, the number one thing that needs to be done right now is safe banking. Because all of these businesses, everything that we've talked about, the companies that would make a product that has 100 milligrams of CBD or more so that you and I could experiment with what Dr. Goldstein was talking about there. The companies that would make that stuff, they cannot use the federal banking system. They don't have access to business lines of credit. They are, as I've said before, they're workers, they're bud tenders, they're dealing with large bags of cash, which has made them targets for robberies and all kinds of crime. It is a situation that needs to change. And it's exciting that Chuck Schumer says that's going to be top of mind when they do return from their recess. Now, the jury's still out on how likely it is to pass because there is still resistance on the Republican side of this. And of course, like anything that passes on Capitol Hill, there are going to be attempts made to add things to this bill that may ultimately make it a poison pill. Nobody's going to want to swallow it on the other side. And that might mean that safe banking doesn't happen until, a few more years down the road. However, it is exciting that there's talk of it, that it's back on the front of the docket for them, that it's top of mind. And it is possible that something could change on that front before the end of this year. And by 2024, all the legal cannabis businesses may finally be able to access U.S. bank accounts. And you and I can use our, credit cards when we go and buy cannabis instead of having to be stuck with debit or cash only or withdraw from the ATMs on site or whatever. It'll just be a lot more like a functioning business in the year 2023, which I'm very excited about. I know you are as well. So I thought that was worth bringing to your attention. I hope you enjoyed all the information that was provided in this episode. Again, feel free to engage with the show at C-Man Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And for anybody who wants to support the show, as I mentioned, just keep an eye out for that subscribe button. And if you feel like giving, if you feel like supporting the show for what has been provided here for you, then that is much appreciated. But I love everybody who listens to this and everybody who engages in any way. This is an exciting time, and cannabis enthusiasts unite. So that's all I've got for you this week, and tune in next week for another episode of the Cannabis Man Podcast. Bye-bye. Cannabis Man is 100% originally crafted by myself, Don Kleppen. Original theme music written and composed by Yusu Kim, aka Goodson.